Tonight, we begin with a high-stakes law enforcement operation that U.S. officials, intelligence analysts, and local authorities had tracked, predicted, and prepared for. A luxury bunker raid that unfolded not over months, but in mere hours. Hours that seized billions in illicit assets. Hours that exposed deep international criminal networks. Hours that sparked protests across Minneapolis. What the Maduro-linked operation attempted today crossed a line that federal authorities had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, ICE and the DEA did not hesitate. They responded with precision, decisiveness, and overwhelming force. For nearly a year now, there have been quiet signals, unusual property acquisitions, encrypted communications, and financial anomalies. Not from public filings, not from formal investigations, just intelligence whispers that Maduro-linked financiers were preparing something unprecedented. The network had been cautious, yes, but they had been brazenly secretive in their caution. Their moves followed a certain pattern, a calculated rhythm, almost a choreographed sequence. But what set off alarm bells in federal law enforcement this week was that the pattern went silent. Experts who monitor international money laundering know the indicators. The sudden halt of financial transactions, the withdrawal of high-value assets, the disappearance of known operatives, the sudden blackout of communication channels. All of that went quiet. And whenever Maduro-linked networks go quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Early Tuesday morning, federal intelligence sources detected what they described as covert asset transfers and bunker fortification, including tunnels and hidden vaults that had not been accessed in over 6 months. These are the kinds of high-security facilities that international cartels only activate when they are signaling something very specific: emergency cash storage, weapons consolidation, safe house fortification. Local observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Maduro-linked operatives were changing operational posture. And when organized criminal networks shift fortification strategy without explanation, even federal authorities pay attention. The response issued by ICE and DEA tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Senior law enforcement sources, after a coordinated briefing, described the network's move as daring, coordinated, and perhaps most importantly, indicative of large-scale international laundering operations. But warnings only work if the target hesitates. The cartel did not. In fact, their response today was among the fastest, most precise we've seen in domestic countercrime operations. Here's what we know. Within hours of the raid approval, ICE and DEA executed multi-location tactical strikes. These weren't the ordinary asset seizures. These were high-value tactical interventions, armored tactical teams, and federal surveillance tools that law enforcement only deploys when preparing to dismantle high-stakes criminal networks. Tonight, federal sources confirmed that ICE and DEA launched coordinated raids on Minnesota luxury bunkers, including a fortified estate in Edina that had recently been linked to Maduro-connected shell companies for what analysts believe was billions in illicit funds and contraband storage. Agents struck before the network could relocate assets. They hit hidden cash vaults. They hit crypto storage servers. They hit weapon caches that were likely preparing to support transnational smuggling operations. In other words, federal authorities targeted the operational backbone of a Maduro-linked criminal enterprise. The communication networks and transport vehicles that would have made it operational were seized. This is what made authorities' warnings so urgent. Maduro-linked moves weren't just symbolic. They were actionable. They represented the kind of move that could fund and destabilize international operations if left unchecked. And ICE and DEA, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't storm unverified properties. They didn't expose civilians to unnecessary risk. They hit critical asset hubs. They hit hidden logistical nodes. And here's where the story becomes even more intense. Federal intelligence now believes that Maduro-linked operatives' latest bunker fortifications were designed to test the responsiveness of U.S. law enforcement after recent border seizure weaknesses. The network wanted to see whether authorities would react slowly, but instead, the opposite happened. ICE and DEA didn't hesitate. They executed a multi-pronged strike that was so precise, so calculated, that even Maduro-linked financiers noticed. You don't get international criminal networks' attention easily. But today, federal authorities did. A senior intelligence analyst speaking with NBC News under anonymity described a network shift as bold provocation, a way to pressure U.S. authorities. But IC and DEA proved today that they remain both methodical and decisive. Their actions were not only strategic, they were surgical. So precisely that billions in cash and assets were seized without a single civilian casualty. That operational element matters because it shows U.S. law enforcement's readiness. It shows that they are not passive observers. They are active enforcers, as reports continue coming in throughout the evening. We learn more about the scale of IC and DEA's response. DEA tactical teams carried out simultaneous bunker raids, forcing Maduro-linked operatives into lockdown. ICE financial crimes units targeted banking accounts and shell companies that have been active in the last 12 months. Federal surveillance units, operating air and ground recon, reportedly intercepted communication channels used by Maduro-linked networks to coordinate movement of illicit funds. This wasn't just a simple raid. This wasn't just a financial seizure. This was an unprecedented, multi-agency operation. This was a clear message to transnational criminal networks. And multi-agency coordination is the one thing Maduro-linked networks have struggled to maintain since initial U.S. sanctions. For every advance in concealment, ICE and DEA have countered with something that disrupted operations at the root. Remember, Maduro-linked networks thought U.S. authorities were slow to act. They thought their money laundering channels were untouchable. They thought domestic luxury hideouts were beyond scrutiny. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Billions seized. Luxury bunkers exposed. Protests igniting in Minneapolis. What makes this moment so critical and so high pressure is that Maduro-linked operatives' latest moves happen at a time when U.S. federal agencies are under political and public scrutiny. Congressional oversight wants total transparency. Local communities want safety and justice. International partners want coordination on illicit funds. Opposition factions want prevention of violent backlash. Federal agencies are balancing these demands while simultaneously dismantling a deeply embedded international criminal network. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. ICE's official statement, now released via press conference, was designed to signal that U.S. authorities are not willing to allow transnational criminal networks to operate freely. Officials said plainly that Maduro-linked operatives' bunker fortifications were inconsistent with lawful operations and national security expectations. That is direct, uncompromising language for, we will seize illicit assets and dismantle networks wherever they operate. You don't usually hear that tone from IC or DA unless something serious is at stake. Meanwhile, DEA administrator addressed the press in a calm, resolute speech tonight. She said, "We will not tolerate the flow of illicit funds into our communities." She said, "Our coordinated actions today send a message to criminal networks worldwide." She said, "This is not just enforcement. It is protection for our citizens and our democracy." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from federal law enforcement that understands just how high the stakes have become. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Maduro-linked networks' latest move wasn't isolated. Along with luxury bunkers, international money laundering cells also activated dormant accounts. Transport intermediaries moved cash and crypto assets. Communication networks increased encrypted operations targeting domestic banks. All of this happened within the same 24-hour window. When criminal networks move multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Maduro-linked networks are preparing to relocate assets internationally. Another is that they are attempting to test U.S. law enforcement's operational speed. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that they are attempting to fund large-scale domestic destabilization. But today, ICE and DEA took that card off the table. They didn't wait and watch. They didn't limit seizures to minor assets. They didn't allow communication networks to survive. They struck decisively. What we're watching now is a test of federal authority and readiness. Maduro-linked operatives want to see how much they can evade detection. ICE and DEA want to show their reach and precision. Congressional oversight wants to prevent failures in enforcement, and local authorities want to prevent civil unrest from escalating tonight. We've heard from federal monitoring teams who are now tracking asset flows and community response. They say billions in cash and crypto were seized. They say key operatives were arrested and interrogated. And they say Maduro-linked operatives' bunker fortifications are likely part of a broader strategy to launder funds and protect high-value assets internationally. But IC and DEA are not reactive. In fact, they are proactive and relentless. Their response today, strategic, precise, and overwhelming, sent a message to Maduro-linked networks that their operations are no longer untouchable. And it sent a message to domestic authorities that U.S. law enforcement can act decisively under pressure. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Maduro-linked networks hope to achieve. But what we do know is that IC and DEA's action was timely. It prevented billions from being moved offshore. It disrupted a critical criminal network. And it reassured domestic and international partners. What happens next will depend on what the networks do in the next days and weeks. If they attempt to retaliate, this moment will be remembered as a turning point in U.S. domestic enforcement against transnational crime. If they stay silent, federal authorities have already shown they are ready and fully capable. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in months, Maduro-linked operatives appear to be on the defensive. Minnesota luxury hideouts are quiet, too quiet. And when these networks are quiet, it means they are reassessing, recalibrating, and planning their next moves. Because tonight, they learned something they have learned many times. U.S. authorities can strike decisively. No asset is beyond reach. Federal law enforcement coordination is unmatched. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. ICE and DEA are not to be underestimated. Criminal networks will be disrupted, and billions in illicit